Great. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Is that a good enough screen for you?
Take what you can get.
Yeah. Ah. Okay, we'll take what we can get. All right. Well, I'm actually kind of talked about the PSYOP angle of 9/11 in my earlier talk, the first one today. So I've actually done a slightly different talk. This time is cui bono 9/11. Who benefits when a crime is committed? The first thing the investigator looks for is who might have benefited from the crime. And in hindsight, it's pretty obvious that radical Muslims or any kind of Muslims didn't exactly benefit. As I mentioned in the first presentation, over 30 million Muslims have been killed, according to Dr. Gideon Palya, based on the fallout from 9/11. And rather than pushing Muslims and Islamic resistance forces deeper to giving them advantages, those forces have been battered as the empire and including the Zionist empire has expanded based on 9/11. So who did benefit? Well, here we have Larry Silverstein, the man who purchased the World Trade Center 2 months before 9/11. He already owned Building 7. He bought the rest of it and finished buying it 2 months before 9/11. At that point, it was condemned for asbestos. There was a court case ordering the city Port Authority to scrape off all the asbestos from the bottom, 40 or 50 floors of the steel frame members. This would have cost many billions, far more than the buildings were worth. They had high vacancy the problems. They had bad, antiquated infrastructure, and they were white elephants. And the city had been looking for a way to demolish them for years. So 2 months before 9/11, Larry Silverstein made what would have been the worst investment in history by picking up those buildings on a 100-year lease. He only put down about 15 million of his own money with a little over 100 million from other investors. And boom, he hit the jackpot on September 11th. He had doubled the insurance, meanwhile, from what the Port Authority had carried. And then he went back into court after 9/11 and redoubled that by claiming double indemnity on the basis of two completely separate and unrelated terrorist events. So Larry benefited. Rudy Giuliani would have benefited if he'd become the 9/11 president like he tried to become. Fortunately, the 9/11 Truth Movement got in his knew that those towers were going to come down before they did, and he never told the firefighters. He's on record on mainstream media saying that they moved out to a different location because they were warned that the towers were coming down. And he never neglected to tell the firefighters. So the We Are Change 9/11 truth activists dogged Rudy and knocked him out of the presidential race. So who did benefit from 9/11 besides Larry and Rudy Giuliani? Well, a lot of people made a lot of money in a lot of ways off 9/11. One of the obvious ways is the put options. This has been certified by two different academic studies, I believe one out of Switzerland, one out of the University of Illinois, showing that indeed the put-call ratio was way out of whack on 9/11, massive insider trading. People knew it was going to happen, and the 9/11 Commission said, don't worry, it wasn't Al-Qaeda. Seriously, that's what the 9/11 Commission report tells us. They don't worry about the insider trading. It was done by some group with no, quote, no conceivable link to Al-Qaeda. Who else benefited from 9/11? Well, the military-industrial complex. Look at that. Where 2001 happens, that jump upward is 9/11. Massive piles of money were made. Somebody benefited here. It was not radical Muslims. Okay, let's look at some people who've actually admitted that they benefited. George W. Bush called a party for the CIA a few weeks after 9/11 and basically celebrated their success. I mean, that's what it really boils down to. The Truth Movement hasn't made a big deal out of this, but maybe we should. T.H. Meyer in his book Reality, Truth, and Evil has focused on this. Bush said, I can't thank you enough on behalf of the American people. And it gets worse. As Robert Baer, former top CIA person for the entire Middle East, has reported, he was told by a very high-level official right after 9/11 that when the dust settles, 9/11 will be seen for what it really was, an intelligence smashing success, an intelligence triumph, not an intelligence failure. What could that possibly mean? 3,000 people dead. that civil liberties destroyed, wars started. You know, there could be as many as a million plus New Yorkers dead from the fallout of 9/11. That was a recent study out of Australia. I don't know if you all saw that, but we reported that, I believe, on False Flag Weekly News last week. So that's an intelligence triumph. Well, what kind of intelligence triumph might that guy have been talking about? Who else benefited from 9/11? Well, Donald Trump, even though Donald Trump is on the record on 9/11 itself saying he could see that these buildings were obviously blown up. There were demolitions, there was explosives. Plus, there's no way, he said, that a plane could have entered seamlessly the way it looked like it did on the videos without the steel frame members being perhaps simultaneously blown up to allow for a plane entry. Trump said all that on 9/11. But he went on to benefit greatly from 9/11 by becoming the real 9/11 president. I mean, he got into office based on the Islamophobia that's been the primary result and the intended result, of course, of 9/11. So Dick Cheney is on the record admitting that he benefited from 9/11. This was an interview he did I think on Fox in December 2008, just as he was leaving office. They asked, what was the highest moment of the past 8 years? And he says, the highest moment of the past 8 years. He says, well, you know, he said, I think the most important, most compelling was 9/11 itself. You could almost hear that mad chuckle getting started. So he's practically on the record, you know, chortling over his triumph on 9/11. And certainly he benefited in many ways, not least of all with a 3,281% increase in his Halliburton stocks based on the wars that 9/11 generated for him. He also benefited in terms of his Cheney doctrine. This was, I believe, the ideological cover that 9/11 was sold to certain selected members of the intelligence community and so on, military people with high enough security clearance. The excuse for 9/11 was that, as Cheney says, if there's a 1% chance that the Pakistani scientists could build a nuke and give it to Al-Qaeda, we have to take it as a certainty. Right? What does that really mean? What that really means was that there was a lot of nuclear funny business going on right before 9/11. They had to wrap up the AQ Khan nuclear. Pakistani scientist Khan was shopping nukes around to Libya and elsewhere to other Middle Eastern countries, and certain parties felt that that was unacceptable. Something really major had to be done. Well, you know, and so they say, imagine what would happen imagine catastrophic terrorism, imagine a nuke going off in an American city, something terrible happening, how that would change everything. So they imagined, and they said, well, if we could do a sort of preemptive, proactive thing that didn't really cause as much damage as a nuke going off in the middle of New York actually would, a bigger nuke anyway, we'll do that. So that's 9/11 benefited Cheney, so he could sell his Cheney doctrine and juice up the security complex and take the military and the intelligence agencies off of their leash and just let them do any damn thing they wanted, torture, kill, anything you want, it's all now legal. So those guys benefited as well. And they sold it to their people by saying that we need this to take down the problem of nuclear proliferation. Huge backstory there. It would take me a long time to give it to you, involving Israel stealing old South African nukes and pretending that Saddam had them and all this kind of funny stuff. But we won't go there right now. Okay, who else benefited? Well, the PNAC people admitted in advance that they were going to benefit from 9/11. Exactly 1 year before 9/11, they called for a catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. That, they said, would be the only way to get what they needed. Preemptive wars in the Middle East, massively juiced up military budget, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So who else benefited? Well, Donald Rumsfeld admitted that 9/11 was, in his view, quote, a blessing in disguise. That's an admission, isn't it? I mean, a blessing, 9/11 a blessing? That's like this top CIA official calling it an intelligence triumph, not an intelligence failure. It's admitting that this is a great thing, and hey, we did it, and we got away with it, and it allows us to do all these things, this whole shopping list of things that we wanted to do. Interestingly, Rumsfeld had spent the year before 9/11 handing out hundreds, if not thousands, of copies of Roberta Wohlstetter's book on Pearl Harbor, telling people how important it was. Now, she was the wife of Albert Wohlstetter, the most important strategist that you never heard of. He basically was the top defense intellectual in the United States for a couple of decades, and he was the mentor of Paul Wolfowitz, who then became, and Richard Perle, his son-in-law, who then became the top defense intellectuals for the period that created 9/11. And Roberta Wilshetter's book basically operates on two levels. If you read it fast from a naive standpoint, you read the official version of Pearl Harbor. If you read it critically, the way Leo Strauss taught his neoconservative disciples to read, you see that she is telling you that she knows that they made Pearl Harbor happen on purpose through that 8-point plan that was designed to make sure the Japanese would strike first, and that they intentionally allowed 2,000 American sailors to be sacrificed to the gods of war to turn around 80% anti-war public opinion and get the U.S. into World War II. That's what Pearl Harbor really was. That's what Roberta Wilshetter tells you she knows it was, and everybody who's in the know knows it was, as she writes this in this book, that also, it's sneakily enough written that the mass audience is not necessarily going to get that. And here's Rumsfeld giving out many, many copies of this book before 9/11. As the film Pearl Harbor comes out, as all the Pearl Harbor propaganda comes out. And here's Wolfowitz, Wilshetter's disciple and Leo Strauss's disciple, saying 9/11 was, quote, a wake-up call. Well, a wake-up call is a good thing, right? Just like Rumsfeld, just like that intelligence official saying that it was an intelligence triumph, Wolfowitz is saying this is a wake-up call that we needed to get all that stuff that we asked for in Project for a New American Century's Rebuilding America's Defenses memo, calling for a new Pearl Harbor. It was a good thing in the eyes of Mr. Wolfowitz. And Wolfowitz, according to Brian Bogart, who's a peace studies researcher at the University of Oregon, or he was when I interviewed him, and I haven't found a whole lot of documentation on this. Maybe you guys can help me. I haven't tried that hard. Anyway, Brian Bogart has told me that Wolfowitz has a lifelong obsession with this remark by Albert Speer that if Germany had been blessed with a Pearl Harbor, it would have won World War II, because Pearl Harbor mobilized the country so intensively that it allowed for the U.S. to go into the war at full gallop and win the war. So that's the kind of thing they were hoping they could get from 9/11, the new Pearl Harbor. And for more information on that, please watch this terrific documentary by Massimo Mazzucco called September 11th, The New Pearl Harbor. And it goes into all of the debunkers' objections to 9/11 truth assertions. It covers both sides of the debate, does so quite well, admirably, and truthfully. A brilliant piece of filmmaking, and it starts out with that Pearl Harbor comparison. So when 9/11 happened, we've already been prepped. Rumsfeld's been handing out Wolshetter's book. The blockbuster movie Pearl Harbor has been blasted at the American people that very summer. And suddenly on 9/11 itself, everybody's chanting in unison, Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor. Zbigniew Brzezinski had repeatedly said that the U.S., basically hinted the U.S. couldn't possibly pursue foreign policy the way it needed to without a Pearl Harbor. That's the only way we got into World War II. Bush's diary on 9/11 itself said today was the Pearl Harbor of the century. We had Chuck Hagel, Henry Kissinger, all the newscasters, Time Magazine, repeatedly chanting Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor the second this happened. And the 9/11 Commission, of course, said it was just like Pearl Harbor, except it wasn't the Japanese, it was Al-Qaeda. Well, thank you, 9/11 Commission, for that. So who else has admitted that they benefited from 9/11? Well, top on the list, I mean, the most blatant admission thus far has come from Bibi Netanyahu, current Prime Minister of Israel, who says that, well, on September 11th, he said that he was asked, what's your take on what happened? And he said, it's very good. And then he kind of caught himself and he said, well, it's not good, but it's really good for Israel. And then once again in 2008 here, he repeated that and said that we are benefiting from one thing, and that's from 9/11, or rather from 9/11 and the wars in Iraq, the war in Iraq. So these are the two prime admissions from Bibi Netanyahu, and I'm sure he's said far more explicit things in private with people he trusts. And of course, that stands to reason, because Bibi Netanyahu is, in a sense, the architect of the entire war on terror, which was created in broad outline in 1979 at the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism. He called in George H.W. Bush, Henry Scoop Jackson, and a number of top defense intellectuals to set the stage for the next international period following the Cold War. Now, this was 1979. We still had 10 more years of the Cold War to go, but they were already seeing that it was going to end. And what's coming next? What's going to justify the military budgets, the security apparatus? What's the public opinion molding kind of framework? We're going to have a war on terrorism. And Bibi, of course, wanted to sell that because he knew he could try to cast Israel's enemies, not only the Palestinians that they're exterminating in what amounts to a genocide under international law, but also the 1.5+ billion Muslims around the world who support the Palestinians, as well as the great many other people throughout the world who support the Palestinians. All of those people would be cast as the new enemy, the terrorists. And that's certainly to the benefit of Greater Israel, the project to extend Israel's borders indefinitely. And here we have Joe Klein of Time magazine, I believe. Was it Time or Newsweek? I think it was Time, who talks about his private conversations with top neoconservatives who all told him how wonderful this Iraq war would be for Israel, and that was the real reason for it. And that's no longer any real secret. Steven Nagoski's book, The Transparent Cabal, laid this out in detail many, many years ago, as have many other books. It had nothing to do with oil companies. Oil companies didn't want an Iraq war. They wanted stability. The Iraq war is 100% the product of the hardcore neoconservative wing of the Israel lobby. And who was it who said right here he said within a mile radius of here are the 25 or 30 people that made everything happen, basically both Iraq 9/11 and the Iraq War that it was designed to create. Here we have Philip Zelikow, a hardcore neoconservative Zionist who was appointed as the 9/11 czar after Henry Kissinger was laughed out of that position or driven out of that position by the victims' family members. Philip Zelikow here is admitting that the real threat, what 9/11, but he's explicitly addressing the Iraq war, but he's implicitly addressing 9/11 as well. He says the real threat is the threat that dare not speak its name, and that is the threat to Israel. So again, what is this all about? Well, as I said in my earlier presentation, killing more than 30 million Muslims in a war to protect Israel's geostrategic interests in expansion. And here's Philip Zelikow admitting that that's who benefited. Interestingly, Zelikow has co-authored a piece published in 1998, co-authored with Ash Carter, among others, that imagined what would happen if there were a huge catastrophic terror event, such as the destruction of the World Trade Center. So he's looking at the likely political, psychological, and sociological consequences of a new Pearl Harbor-style event, such as if the towers had been demolished by the '93 bomb. That's what they said in this 1998 article. But of course, it was looking ahead to 9/11. Zelikow describes himself as an expert in, quote-unquote, the creation and maintenance of public myths. So this is the guy they chose to be the czar of the 9/11 Commission. So there's a paper trail here also showing that the same hardline Likudnik Zionist faction benefited from 9/11 because there's a whole paper trail leading up to it. I mentioned the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism in 1979 and Bibi Netanyahu's 2 compilation books based on that. And then we fast forward to 1996 with the Clean Break document, again commissioned by Bibi Netanyahu. That document essentially calls for all the same things that Rebuilding America's Defenses called for, but this document, commissioned by Netanyahu in '96, written by essentially the same people, Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith. These are the same people that would be on PNAC and give us this document calling for 9/11. Well, here in 1996, they're calling for all the same stuff. They didn't say New Pearl Harbor, but it's basically the same thing. We need basically to do regime change in the Middle East, balkanize the region on behalf of Israel. And so then the same people were drafted by the United States to draft essentially the same thing, but framing it in terms of the benefits to American empire rather than to Israeli empire. And frankly, there have been no benefits to American empire. 9/11 has only benefited the Israeli empire. We have here the Dancing Israelis, Joel Kovel, another Jewish American truth teller, as we've seen so many, is talking about the Dancing Israelis set up to film ahead of time, filming the attack on the Trade Center and admitting that there they were celebrating with their cigarette lighters in front of the burning and then exploding towers, and admitting on television in Israel that they were there to document the event. That's another admission of benefits. They basically have been crowing about how great 9/11 was, because now the Americans know what it is to suffer from those evil Islamic terrorists. So I'll skip over these miscellaneous admissions, but there have been other cases of Israelis admitting how that 9/11 was a huge boon for them. And we mentioned earlier, actually, that the shock doctrine includes this crucial passage. Jeremy Roth-Kushel mentioned in an earlier presentation that Naomi Klein found that 9/11 totally rescued Israel economically and militarily, in part by taking a collapsing economy and making it a robust, booming success within a couple of years. They put all their chips into the security market and the anti-terror market, and they came to dominate that industry within just a year or two after 9/11. Additionally, they were able to crush the Palestinians in ways they would never have been allowed to had it not been for 9/11. The current Balkanization of the Middle East that's happening as a result of 9/11 is all part of the Israeli plan that was revealed many years ago, the Oded Yinon plan. The most recent manifestation is the Ralph Peters blood map. This is how the Middle East should look. All these countries should be balkanized along ethnic and sectarian lines. There'll be no countries left big enough to ever pose a long-term threat to Israel. And there's Oded Yinon describing precisely what he's going to do back in the 1980s. The dissolution of Iraq into ethnically or religiously unique areas, such as in Lebanon, and Syria will fall apart. Well, that's exactly what they've done. This was all planned 40 years ago. 9/11 was the catalyst to make it possible. And now this endless war on Islam disguised as a war on terror is the product. And again, there's really only one geostrategic beneficiary, and that is Greater Israel. So here we are. 9/11, in essence, in my estimation, was a Zionist coup d'etat by hardline neoconservative Likudnik Zionists, Wolfowitz, Pearl, people are in Cheney's office. And it was, the Americans were essentially hoodwinked with this Cheney doctrine BS about nuclear weapons that could go off any time. And in fact, the Israelis had stolen those nuclear weapons from South Africa and said that Saddam had them, and he didn't. Israel sold some to North Korea and kept the rest. Long story there, but basically they sold this to the U.S. as though 9/11 would be great for American empire, would allow us to take the gloves off and go after our enemies. And it would be like Pearl Harbor. You know, we'd go out and have a rousing victory for America, yada, yada, yada. And I think they all knew that was highly unlikely. I think they all knew that what this really was about was destroying and balkanizing the Middle East so that Israel could continue its genocide and continue to expand while busting up all the countries around it into these smaller, impotent, chaotic units. So this is the reason that more than 30 million Muslims have been murdered around the world since 9/11 for Israeli expansionism. And for, you know, because I am willing to say that, I've got a big scarlet letter on my back. I'm not welcome to speak in a lot of places, including the Left Forum, because the people running the Left Forum are ultimately running interference for the perpetrators of 9/11 and this Israeli geostrategic project, including the genocide of Palestine. So talk about Holocaust deniers. I've never denied any Holocaust, but I think the organizers of the Left Forum are the Holocaust deniers. They are denying the Holocaust of 30 million Muslims around the world because of this false flag atrocity that they and their people, the people that they are running interference for, actually perpetrated. So I am saying that Marcus and the other people here at the Left Forum who won't allow this message to be spoken in public are Holocaust perpetrators, which is a lot worse than being a mere supposed Holocaust denier simply because you say you support free speech everywhere.
Thank you, Kevin. Can you hear me? Thank you, Kevin, for giving us an update on the, well, obviously who has benefited from this grotesque event and what it has spawned over the last 16 years. We're now going to hear from Richard Gage, who's going to give us an update on the science and potentially on the Halsey report about the destruction and the controlled demolition of the buildings that took place on 9/11. Richard Gage, AIA, was a San Francisco Bay architect of 28 years and is founder and CEO of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, ae911truth.com. He launched the organization in 2006. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Good night.